there's one thing we've all seen over the past several years. It's that these products that we carry around in our pockets in the form of these technologies have a profound impact on our day-to-day lives, right? They've somehow changed our daily habits. And so what I've done over the past several years is to try and look for patterns. What is it about these products that in a very short period of time can so profoundly change users' day-to-day habits and their day-to-day lives? What I found was in exploring these habits was that their business models depended on these habits, that these companies would go out of business if it wasn't for the fact that they were bringing customers back on their own. Meaning customers weren't necessarily relying on spammy messages or expensive advertising. Somehow these companies had formed habits inside their user base and their users were using these products on their own. Right? They were coming back unprompted. And so I wanted to figure out what was at the core of these habits. Now, that being said, not every business needs a habit. Right? There are plenty of companies that can do great things for their customers that are very good businesses that don't require these habits. But if your business model does require a habit, what I'm going to show you is a design pattern that you have to have built into your product. Okay? Not every business model needs to form a habit, but if you need a habit, you need what's called a hook. Just so that we're all on the same page about what we talk about when we say habits, the definition of a habit is this impulse to do a behavior with little or no conscious thought. It's about 40% of what you do, day in and day out, whether you like it or not, is done purely out of habit. These behaviors done with little or no conscious thought. And I believe that we're on the precipice of an age where we can use habits for good, where we can help people live happier, healthier, more productive lives. And that's, of course, what I want to help you do today. And there's an explosion of these companies today, many of them right here in San Francisco, that are using the psychology of habit design to help people live better. Okay? So that's what I hope you're in for tonight. So here's the pattern. Here's the design pattern that we see repeated time and time again in these habit-forming products. It's called the hook. The hook is defined as an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And it's through successive cycles, through these hooks, through this four-step process of a trigger, action, reward, investment. You see this kind of infinite loop here. This is how customer preferences are shaped, how tastes are formed, and how these habits take hold. Let's start with the trigger phase. The trigger is the first step of the hook, and it's a cue to action. It tells the user what to do next. All triggers are these cues. They tell the user what to do next, and they come in two types, two flavors, if you will. We have our external triggers, and we have internal triggers. External triggers you'll be very familiar with, right? We in the design community know all about these external triggers. These are things in our environment that tell us what to do next by giving us some piece of information. Okay, the information is in the trigger itself. Click here, buy now, tweet this, right? A friend telling you through word of mouth about this great new app you should try out, all examples of external triggers. But what I find product people don't think about enough, and yet turns out to be absolutely critical to forming these long-term habits, is creating an association with what's called an internal trigger. Turns out the most frequent internal triggers are these emotions, but not just any emotion. Specifically, they are negative emotions. So what we do when we're feeling bored or lonesome or indecisive or fearful or fatigued or lost, what we do when we experience these negative emotions dictates the products and services that we turn to for relief. We'll move on to the next step of the hook, the action phase. The action phase is the behavior itself. It's the habit. The definition of the action phase of the hook is the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. Now, it turns out there's actually a formula to predict the likelihood of these singular behaviors. It comes to us from a researcher at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg. Fogg tells us that for any human behavior, as represented by B, we need three things. Every click, every action, every behavior requires sufficient motivation, sufficient ability. Ability is how easy or difficult a behavior is to do, and a trigger must be present. Let me quickly explain these three things for you. Motivation is the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. Now, motivation is one of these things that psychologists have been arguing about for decades and decades, but Fogg gives us these 6 basic levers that we can pull on to boost user motivation, to make people more likely to do a behavior by increasing their energy for action. Because all of us as human beings, fundamentally, we seek pleasure, we avoid pain. We seek hope, and we avoid fear. We seek social acceptance, and we avoid social rejection. The A stands for ability. Ability is how difficult or easy something is to do, the capacity to do a particular behavior. And here again, we have these 6 levers that we can pull on to make any behavior more likely to occur by decreasing how much time it takes, how much money it costs, reducing the physical effort. Brain cycles. Brain cycles is a big one when it comes to technology products because it turns out the more difficult something is to understand, the less likely that behavior is to occur. Reducing the cognitive load increases the likelihood of the behavior occurring. Social deviance tells us that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And finally, non-routine says that we become more likely to do something simply for the fact that we have done it before in the past. So Fogg puts together these 3 basic elements of motivation, ability, and triggers on this graph. That's very useful in a product development context. If you're building, for those of you who raised your hands and say, I want to figure out how to make my product more habit-forming, if you've built a product and darn it, people aren't using it, right? And you're scratching your head trying to figure out why aren't people clicking? Why aren't people activating? Why aren't people doing the things we want them to do? For any human behavior, you can ask yourself, does the user have sufficient motivation? High motivation at the top, low motivations at the bottom. Does the user have sufficient ability? If a behavior is easy to do, it's way over there on the right. If a behavior is difficult to do, if they lack ability, it's over here on the left. And if the user has sufficient motivation and sufficient ability, they cross that blue threshold, and if a trigger is present, the behavior will occur. Every single time. Online, offline, doesn't matter. Any human behavior. Now let's move on to the reward phase of the hook. The reward is where the user's itch is scratched, where they get what they came for. When we talk about rewards, we have to start in the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which was first studied by 2 Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner, who discovered that when they implanted electrodes into the brains of lab animals, and they allowed these lab animals to self-stimulate, they could push on a little lever to send an electrical current to this part of the brain, what they found is that these lab animals stimulated their nucleus accumbens incessantly. They would run across painful electrified grids. They would forgo food. They would forgo water just to continue to activate this part of the brain time and time again. In later experiments done on people, they observed similar results. That when people were handed this little button to press on to send an electrical jolt to this part of the brain, they did so hundreds of times. Some of the people had to have these machines forcibly removed from them to get them to stop clicking on these buttons, sending this current to their nucleus accumbens. Well, it turns out we don't need shocks to the brain to stimulate your nucleus accumbens because your nucleus accumbens is activated every single day with things like luxury goods, sex, certain chemicals, junk food, and of course right there in the center technology, all activate this very same part of your brain every single day. We now know that variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens, creating this itch, this stress of desire. And so in all sorts of products that we find most habit-forming, most engaging, the things that hold on to your attention and won't let go, you will find one or more of these 3 variable reward types. what I call rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Let me introduce these to you briefly. Rewards of the tribe are social rewards, things that feel good, that have an element of variability, and come from other people. So the search for empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good, partnership, cooperation, competition, all examples of things come from other people, feel good, and have this element of variability. Next is the search for resources, rewards of the hunt. Rewards of the hunt stem from our primal search for food and other material possessions. And in modern society, we buy these things with money. So when people think of variable rewards, sometimes they think of gambling. They think of slot machines, right? Where the variable reward is the currency, the money that comes out of these machines. That's part of what makes these gambling machines habit-forming, if not all-out addictive. And it turns out we find the same exact psychology online. Consider the feed. Why is it that so many products today have this feed mechanic? Why is the feed in everything? Do you notice this? Right? Everything seems to have a feed today. Well, let's take a look at Twitter's feed as an example. When I open up my Twitter timeline, maybe that first tweet is not that interesting, and the second tweet's not that interesting, but maybe the third or fourth is interesting. And what do I have to do to get more of that reward, to get more of these information rewards? What do I have to do? Scroll. So that's scrolling, and scrolling uses the exact same psychology as pulling on a slot machine. Finally comes the rewards of the self, the search for self-achievement. The rewards of the self are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about these material or information rewards. These are things that feel good in and of themselves. They're intrinsically pleasurable. The search for mastery, consistency, competency, and control. Best example I can think of online is gameplay. So when I play Candy Crush or Angry Birds, there's no material rewards. I'm not necessarily even playing with other people, but what I'm getting from that experience is this pleasure of getting to the next level, the next accomplishment. And if you say to yourself, yeah, Nir, that's great, but look, I'm not much of a gamer. That doesn't really apply to me. I bet you play this game every day. Checking those unread messages, finishing the to-dos in your to-do list, or the one that always gets me is that one app notification on my home screen that I just have to open so I can clear it away. All right, you felt that. Those are all examples of rewards of the self. Which finally brings me to the last step of the hook, and perhaps the most overlooked of the 4 steps of the hook, the investment phase. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product in anticipation of a future benefit. It's not about immediate gratification. That's what the action phase is for. The investment phase is something the user does to increase their likelihood of the next pass through the hook. And investments do that. Investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook in 2 ways. The first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by loading the next trigger. Something that the user does to bring themselves back. Let me show you an example. When I send someone a message on WhatsApp, and this slide was in my presentation way before the acquisition, when someone sends a message on WhatsApp to another user, there's no immediate gratification, right? They don't get any points. They don't get any badges. Nothing really happens when they send someone that message. But what I'm doing when I'm investing in this platform by sending a message is that I'm loading the next trigger because I'm likely to get a reply. And that reply comes coupled with that little Joule notification, which is an example of an external trigger, which brings me back through the hook once again. Okay? So the first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass is by loading the next trigger. The next way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass is by storing value. Storing value is a big deal. You know, something that is endemic to all physical products, things that we use in the real world, is that with wear and tear, these things depreciate. These chairs, tables, a carpet, everything in the physical world, the more we use it, the less valuable it becomes. It depreciates. But habit-forming technologies should do the opposite. Habit-forming products should get better with use. They should become more and more valuable. They should appreciate in value. And they do this because of this principle of stored value. So for example, when I add content on iTunes, it becomes better for me. When I invest in new content, it becomes better for me as my one and only music library. The more data I put into a service like Mint or Pinterest for that matter, the more data I give these platforms, the better they become for me. They become more and more valuable, and I can do more and more with them the more data I give these companies. Right? The product becomes better with the more I invest in it. Let me leave you with the most important slide of the presentation. As I mentioned before, not every business needs to form a habit, but every business that needs a habit needs a hook. So if your business model depends upon unprompted engagement, users using the product on their own, you've got to be able to answer these 5 fundamental questions of, number 1, what's the internal trigger? What's the user's itch? Number 2, what's the external trigger that brings the user to the product? Number 3, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward? Number 4, the reward, is it fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And finally, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook?